4 years ago now, when I was 24, my mom died of breast cancer, and since both my grandmothers had also died of it, I went to a specialist for a screening. That's when I found out I had some cells in one of my breasts that could have turned cancerous at any given moment. I was told I had a few options. I could have regular screenings every 3 or 4 months until it developed into cancer. I was told the risk of the cells becoming cancerous was very high due to family history, but there was also the possibility it might never turn, so I'd just be getting these screenings for no reason. I could get a single mastectomy on the breast with the bad cells, but they'd need to keep an eye on the other one, so I'd still need regular checkups for that breast. Or I could get a bilateral mastectomy and remove all of my breast tissue, basically eliminating the risk. I went for the bilateral mastectomy. It was, admittedly, the most drastic option, but after seeing what cancer did to my mom and grandmothers, I didn't want to risk it. They warned me about scarring, but told me it should be fairly minor. It wasn't. I was left with 2 huge, pink, jagged scars on either side of my chest, each about 1 inch long and half an inch wide. It sent me into a severe depression. It got to the stage where I wasn't even leaving my flat because I didn't want people to see me. I threw out my mirrors. I would get physically sick just looking at myself. Eventually, I went to a therapist. They suggested a plastic surgeon. The therapist said they'd never normally do that, but it was clearly something I was struggling with, and I might never get over it. They could see why I struggled. I'll admit, the therapist sent me to ask about scar reduction. The plastic surgeon suggested a cream, a laser, or implants. The cream didn't work. The laser was both expensive and risky. So I went with the implants. My natural breasts were an F cup, so I went with a slightly smaller double D. Since then, my mental health has improved. I feel a lot better about the way I look. My confidence has gone up. My self-esteem too. I know I shouldn't put so much into my appearance, but I wasn't exaggerating about these scars. They were huge, bright pink, jagged, raised, just really awful to look at. I hated seeing myself, and now they're nicely hidden away. You can barely feel them. In the present day, I'm 28 and working in an office. I'm doing a lot better than I was. One day, my coworker Jill found out I'd had a boob job. She didn't know about the cancer thing. I was chatting with an old friend from before the mastectomy. We were planning a holiday, and she made a joke about me going on a plane with my implants. Jill overheard. By the end of the day, the entire office knew I'd had a boob job. But not why. 6 people confirmed that Jill had told them. Over the next few months, Jill made many jokes and comments about my chest to coworkers when I was in earshot. At one point, she said I had more plastic than Barbie. She called me fake in 2 ways. I didn't hear this one myself, but a friend told me Jill had referred to me as a sack of silicone. I don't know what her problem was exactly, but at one point she mentioned the NHS. So I assume Jill thought I got my tits done for free on taxpayer money. For the record, I had the mastectomy on the NHS, but I went private for therapy and implants. I asked her to stop, more than once. Unfortunately, the places I talked to her were places like the lift and the women's bathroom, places without cameras, and Jill just kept making comments no matter how often I asked her not to. I wouldn't say it was every single day, but I heard at least 3 comments per week for 3 months. I hit my breaking point when me, Jill, and a few other coworkers were having lunch. I referred to something as being shallow. Jill said, "You'd know all about being shallow, Faye," while gesturing to my chest. I snapped. I said, "Do you know why I have these? A few years ago, doctors found potentially cancerous cells in my breast tissue. I was advised to get a mastectomy and was left with huge, ugly scars on my chest. I went to see a therapist who sent me to a cosmetic surgeon who advised me to get implants to hide the scars. And I did, just so I could look at myself in the mirror without crying. So maybe next time you want to judge someone for having cosmetic surgery, you should ask them why they had it first." And feeling like that was a mic drop moment, I picked up my food and left. For the rest of the day, about 1/3 of my office came up to me and offered support. The rest told me Jill was just joking around and that I was being a bitch. I replied that Jill was being a bitch long before I was. Then I got an email from HR. They wanted to talk to me the following day, When I called for clarification, they mentioned a hostile work environment. That's apparently an American term and holds little weight in England, but it's what they said. I knew the person who signed off the email. It was Debbie, and she was Jill's friend in HR, so I was fairly confident about who had reported me. I realized that if this was already being sent to HR, I needed as much ammunition as possible. Debbie had dealt with me so far, so it was safe to assume she would be reviewing the complaint with me. And if that was true, I was fucked. I vaguely remembered a section in my contract about complaints. I flicked through it and found the part that said I was contractually allowed to request a change of reviewer if I felt my allocated reviewer was biased. It was called an impartial overseer. I photocopied the page and highlighted that part. Then I messaged the people who had offered their support over Facebook. I said, HR have asked to see me. Do any of you remember Jill insulting me to your face? And are you willing to write and sign something saying what you heard and when? Not everyone was willing to help. Jill is somewhat feared in the office due to her friendships with HR and management. But about 20 people were willing. I guessed roughly when I'd asked Jill to stop previously, the 4 times over the last few months. Some were easy to remember. They'd happened on my break or when I'd first arrived at work. I wrote them all down. I also wrote down a rough time of when the lunchroom confrontation happened and made a list of names of who was there. I got to work slightly early the next morning. I went around everyone who had messaged me and most of them managed to give me a printed and signed letter. Some didn't manage, but no big deal. This isn't the exact wording since there were 16 letters, but the gist was, my name is Name. I work with Jill and me. On date at time, I spoke with Jill, during which she referred to me as insult. I felt this was inappropriate, as it directly related to me's appearance, and I'm willing to go on record further to establish that Jill has been discussing me in the workplace in this manner for 3 months now, causing discomfort and creating what I feel is a hostile work environment. Signed, Name. I ended up with 16 letters, all from different people. One of them was in the lunchroom for the confrontation. Some even had bullet-pointed lists of everything Jill had said, about me, and others. Apparently, Jill had made comments about one coworker's weight, and something anti-Semitic about another coworker's nose, all of which were included. There are about 45 people in the office, so 16 wasn't a majority, but it was still a decent number. The letters weren't very long, just a paragraph or so, but they had all the necessary information. At 10 a.m., I was asked to come to HR. I took the letters, the photocopy of the contract, and my list of dates and names in a little folder. Debbie was there. She stood up from her desk, ready to lead me into a room. I turned to the other HR worker and asked, "So, is my meeting with you then?" Debbie said, "No, you're with me." I replied, "That doesn't sit well with me. My contract states I have a right to an impartial overseer." I took out the contract page and showed her. Debbie read it. I wouldn't let her take the paper. There was a shredder way too close. She said she could be impartial. I replied, "I really don't mean to be a pain, but I have it on good authority that the person on the other end of this complaint is your friend, and my contract does say I'm allowed an impartial overseer." Debbie stomped off to get a supervisor. The supervisor asked how I knew she couldn't be impartial. I explained that Jill and Debbie were close friends. He asked Debbie if that was true. She just said, "I can be impartial." The supervisor took a breath, asked the other HR rep to come with him, and all 4 of us went to review the complaint. Debbie looked absolutely homicidal during the interview. She had clearly anticipated firing me, or at least recommending it. The interview took over half an hour. They kept asking the same questions, phrased in different ways. So, here's the drastically condensed version. They asked why I thought Jill had reported me. I explained that she'd had an issue with me for months. They asked why I didn't come to them. I said I had no issue with her. They asked what Jill's problem was. I told them everything. About the cancer cells, the mastectomy, the scars, the therapy, the implants. I told them Jill found out about the implants, but not the cancer, and began targeting me. I gave them the 16 signed statements. Each one quoted what Jill had said with rough dates and times. They asked about the lunchroom confrontation. I explained what was said, gave names of the other people present, told them there were cameras in the room. I admitted I could have handled it better, but after 3 months, I had to put my foot down. They asked if I'd spoken to Jill before about her behavior. I said yes, several times over the past 3 months. They asked if Jill had ever known about the cancer. I said no. It wasn't mentioned when she overheard me talking, and I didn't feel the need to disclose my medical history to avoid harassment. The supervisor stood up and said, "Well, I think we're done here." He shook my hand and told me they'd review the evidence and get back to me. I returned to my desk, pulled up my CV, prepared to start the job search again. About an hour passed. Then the person who'd written the letter and witnessed the lunchroom conversation got called in. They came back 10 minutes later. One by one, the others who were present got called. Then the people who had written letters. Everyone was gone for about 10 minutes, maybe more. By 3:30, it seemed everyone had been spoken to. Finally, Jill was called in. She was gone for 30 minutes. Came back, fuming. She glared at me while I worked, but I ignored her. At around 4:30, Jill got called back in. At 5 o'clock, people were packing up. Jill stormed back into the office. She packed up her desk while loudly telling anyone who would listen that I got her fired, then shoved her way onto the lift. Minutes later, I got an email from HR. My case was closed.